hands.
I don't know whether you can make this out, but there's like a whooshing kind of noise in here. I don't know what the microphone can pick up in comparison to my ears. Alan Robson live from the dark heart of Paris. I'm in a bone repository, an ossuary, right in the heart of the city. A dark heart it is too. In all directions, skulls and human bones. But one of the most incredible entities ever captured on tape comes from the steel city of Sheffield. Joseph Morris worked as a merchant in the early 1800s, liaising with farms to get the best price he could for their crops. He was trusted by everyone. He was a Sheffield lad, and he prided himself on dealing honestly with all of his clients. He was so successful using this sincere technique that he'd been offered large sums to go to Manchester and Liverpool from larger firms, but he was happy plying his trade in his hometown. Although certainly he wasn't the best looking of men, he was rather too round in the belly and his hair was receding, but he was on the rise. He already had a nice house on the outskirts of the city, but he had an office in Sheaf Street, near where the railway station currently stands. It was there that he first cast his eyes on a rather portly girl called Alice Clark, the daughter of a reverend who lives appropriately on Church Street nearby. She may well have been a big lass, but she had a beautiful face with sparkling brown eyes. Initially, she seemed to have no interest in the chubby merchant until one of her friends said that he was quite a catch, destined to be the richest man in Sheffield. And as soon as that girl said that she wanted him, Alice made it her quest to win him for herself, but for all the wrong reasons. Now, Joseph had enjoyed no success with women at all. At 28, he was almost certainly still a virgin. So when this attractive and rather showy woman began to flutter her eyelashes at him, it was inevitable that he'd fall for her, massively. But Alice had a secret. She had been previously married, only to take all of the man's money and possessions and then return to her father with enough cash to keep her secure for the rest of her life. Prior to that, she'd had several flirtations that seemed to be purely for mercenary purposes. Even so, she came across as this virtuous and innocent girl. Now she was stalking and playing the young merchant for all she could get. Morris began a formal courtship with her father's blessing, and in turn bought her a variety of gifts, beginning with flowers. But very soon it was expensive jewellery, fine gowns, and even her own pony and trap. Once she took his virginity, he was hers to command, and she used him for everything she could get. Joseph had saved and saved and saved since he was a teenager, and had a large figure in the bank, but that figure was tumbling down. And yet he was happy. At long last, he was in love with a woman who loved him in return. Even then, Alice was bragging to her friends that she would never ever marry him. She was merely with him until something better came along. Yet the liaison lasted almost 4 years, and by that time Morris had paid off his house, bought land around it, and become a farmer himself. He was making a lot of money and had lost a little weight, becoming a fine-looking fella. He was more confident and assured, and he was completely lost in love with his lady. It was then his lady met Alain Devereux, a Frenchman visiting Sheffield, and an affair began. It only lasted a week, but Morris knew that something was wrong. On following her to an inn one night, he caught them together in Devereux's room and punched him unconscious and told Alice it was over. The following week, Joseph Morris was utterly depressed and really wanting her back. She'd been the only woman in his life, and he missed her. Devereux moved on. Alice was alone and began to regret her actions. All of her friends looked up to Morris, saying how wonderful and handsome he'd become and how lucky she was. So once again, for all the wrong reasons, Alice began another charm offensive, blaming Morris for neglecting her and forcing her into the arms of another man. And like so many fools before him, he took the cheating woman back and seemed genuinely happy again, even asking her to marry him. He was saying that if they were to share the same house, she need never feel lonely or left out again. Dubious logic, but the kind of tripe that men truly believe rather than being alone. Then, with his confidence slowly rebuilding, Morris went to Church Street to ask her father for a hand. But when he got there, he found her husband, for they were still married, and he was demanding some of his money back, claiming that she had stolen it. This drove Morris into a fury, and off he ran, realising at last what a fool he'd been. His body was found hanging from a tree near where Sheffield United football ground now stands, and the following day Alice had sorted out a compromise with her ex, and agreeing a divorce, she had finally decided to marry Morris. But just as she began searching for him, word came round that he'd taken his own life after writing out a new will, leaving everything to his workforce. This news hit her harder than his death. She would die 4 years later of pneumonia. But ever since, on Church Street, there have been disturbances in one room where she used to sleep, even though over the years it's been shop premises, offices and an apartment. Everyone in there knows that something is going on. Some have seen the figure of a large woman shrieking in torment. On one occasion she was sobbing, tearing her hair out. Yet it was in 1988 that a group of students from the local university decided to put a camera in there with a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The camera caught a shadow that swept up to the camera and knocked it over. This was also captured on tape, along with a woman screaming no. The recording clearly picked it up, and picked up someone moving around. And then from another room, the angst-filled voice of Alice, realising that not only had she lost a rich husband, but more importantly, she'd lost his money. There, on Church Street, people regularly see this mad-eyed woman staring out the window, and those in neighbouring properties have all heard captured screams.
On Metro Radio with Max Merch. Rock out with the best in music merchandise.
Alan Robson with you now. We are telling stories from all over the world tonight because the sound of spirit, the sound of the walking dead is heard everywhere. Every single religion on earth, everyone, believe in spirit. Most of them believe that we come back. And yet, I'm going back to the heart of the north of England. One of the biggest government offices in Britain is the Department of Social Security, based in Long Benton, on the outskirts of Newcastle upon Tyne. Out of the thousands that work there, hundreds have witnessed the floating entity of a lady who worked there in the 1970s. Her name is Margaret. She was one of the first civil servants to work for the pension section. There's an office there that has suffered countless experiences of locked filing cabinets being opened in the middle of the night, papers scattered around after the cleaners have been and checked the room, and on one occasion chairs were piled up onto a desk. Executive officers decided to intervene and locked up the office themselves, having checked that everything was in place. On arriving the next morning, they couldn't get into the office as the desk had been pushed tightly up against the door. Yet the windows hadn't been opened and there was no other way into the room. Julie Hall worked there at the time. At first, pretty much everyone just made a joke of it. We would regularly catch glimpses of the figure in there, and we used to call her Margaret after an old woman who used to work here as a cleaner. It stopped being funny when a young man called Ken Morton tried to move a chair out of there, and a sharp edge cut his arm, severing an artery, and he almost died. After that, a few people slipped on the floor in there, and water was found as if someone was cleaning it. One lady fractured her skull and had to retire. Over the months, we were just waiting for the next thing to happen, and they did. More falls, cuts, grazes. A few people took epileptic fits. Nobody wanted to work in that office. The bosses knew all about it. They refused to work in there at all. It just had a different